The wheelchair was gone. Again. Raymond Calloway sat in the October sun outside the VA, 22 years of service, 2 tours, everything he'd given, and the only thing standing between him and the pavement had been taken by a stranger who didn't even look back. He didn't shout, he didn't call for help. He whispered it so quietly that no one should have heard. They took my wheelchair again, but someone did hear. And what happened next? What 180 men did, what the rest of the country refused to believe until they saw the photograph, will change everything you think you know about who actually protects the people this country forgets. The weight of silence. Raymond Calloway woke before the sun did. That had been his habit since 2004, since the morning a roadside IED in Fallujah, Iraq, had rearranged everything he understood about the word ordinary. His body, which had once carried him through miles of desert patrol in 100-degree heat, now required careful negotiation every morning. A deal made between muscle memory and reality, between the man he had been and the man he'd had to become. The bedroom was small, but precise. Every object had its place, arranged with the deliberate economy of hands that had learned efficiency out of necessity. On the nightstand sat a folded American flag in a triangular glass case, a glass of water, and a framed photograph. Raymond, in his uniform, standing straight and squinting into the Kuwaiti sun alongside 3 other soldiers whose names he still recited quietly before falling asleep each night. He was 58 years old. His hair had gone the color of February frost, cut close in the same military style he'd kept since enlisting at 19. His eyes were pale, winter blue, the kind that had witnessed enough to have stopped registering surprise. His hands were large and calloused, built by 22 years of military service and refined by 2 decades of pushing himself forward, literally and otherwise. The wheelchair sat beside the bed like a faithful companion. It was a lightweight titanium model, not the clunky, hospital-grade chair the VA had originally issued, which had been built by someone who had clearly never needed to use one. This chair was a gift from his daughter, given 4 years ago on his 54th birthday. It moved with him like an extension of his own body, responsive, quiet, the frame carrying small scratches he'd long since stopped trying to polish away. Bakersfield, California did not ease into its mornings. By the time the early October light began cutting through the blinds in thin amber lines across the hardwood floor, the traffic on Truxtun Avenue had already settled into its low, persistent hum. Raymond had lived in this rented house on Pine Street for 11 years. 2 blocks from the VA Medical Center, close enough to hear the facility's backup generators kick on during summer power surges. The neighborhood was working class and weathered in the particular way of neighborhoods that had been working class for a long time. Front yards told the stories of lives stretched thin, a rusted swing set, a boat on cinder blocks that hadn't touched water in years, flower beds that launched each spring with ambition and surrendered somewhere around the end of June. Raymond kept his small front porch clean. Near the bottom of the ramp, which he had designed and helped build himself during his first year on the block with assistance from his neighbor Larry Gibbs, sat a ceramic pot of petunias he refreshed each season without announcement. Larry was 71 now, a retired postal worker with arthritic knees and the habit of checking on Raymond under transparent pretexts. Yesterday, it had been a flathead screwdriver he needed to borrow. Last Tuesday, a measuring tape. Raymond never acknowledged the pattern. He left the borrowed items on the porch railing and let the fiction stand without comment. Some kindnesses worked best, unnamed. He made coffee in the kitchen he had modified over his first year in the house. Low countertops, widened clearances, everything within reach from a seated position. He drank it at the small table by the window and reviewed his schedule for the day on his phone. 9 o'clock at the VA Medical Center. A follow-up with Dr. Patricia Wells regarding the nerve pain in his left hip, which had been worsening since July. Pharmacy pickup afterward. Then, if the day allowed, the public library on Chester Avenue. He'd been working through a collection of military histories, the Western Front, Midway, the Incheon Landing, that kept his evenings purposeful and his mind occupied during the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, which remained consistently the quietest and loudest hours of his day. He had served in the United States Army for 22 years, infantry. He'd deployed to the Gulf in 1991, to Bosnia in 1996, to Iraq in 2003, and back to Iraq in 2004, the deployment that ended the career, the mobility, and the particular forward momentum that military life had provided him since he'd signed his name at 18. What the Army had not prepared him for was the return. Not the physical adaptation, though that had been its own education in patience and pride. What remained unaddressed was the texture of invisibility that settled over a veteran in a world that had moved on without him. The VA, the disability benefits system, the bureaucratic architecture built around the word support. These structures managed consistently to make him feel simultaneously documented and unseen. Forms in triplicate. Waiting rooms that held the weight of unanswered patients. Phone calls that reached automated menus where the right option never quite existed. He finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, and began the careful process of preparing for the morning. He dressed deliberately, as he always did. Clean jeans, a blue flannel button-down, the work boots he still wore out of something that had less to do with function and more to do with the maintenance of self. Pride, in his definition, was not vanity. It was the daily act of refusing erasure. By 8:30, he was outside in the cool October air, the faint scent of eucalyptus drifting from the trees 2 streets north. He locked the front door, descended the ramp, and began the 2-block route to the VA. He no longer used the paratransit service. After 3 consecutive missed pickups in 4 months, he'd decided the distance was his to cross under his own power, on his own schedule. His own power. He would think about that phrase later, when everything changed, when he would consider what it truly meant to possess something, to own the terms of your own movement through the world, and what it felt like to have those terms stolen. But that was still ahead of him. For now, Raymond Calloway moved through the morning air of Bakersfield with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had learned to take nothing for granted. Not even the chair beneath him, not even the ground. What stays and what gets taken. The VA Medical Center on Truxton Avenue was a building that tried harder than it succeeded. The lobby had undergone renovation within the past 3 years, new flooring in neutral tones, improved lighting that made the space feel slightly less oppressive, and a digital check-in kiosk that was supposed to reduce processing times and primarily succeeded in reducing the patience of anyone over 65. The walls displayed framed photographs of veterans across different eras. A Korean war medic crouching over a canvas litter, a Vietnam helicopter crew squinting into the rotor wind, a young woman in desert fatigues with her helmet tucked under her arm, and the flat 1,000-yard backdrop of the Gulf behind her. Raymond passed them every visit without stopping. He recognized the bearing in each image, the specific posture that military service builds into a person, a geometry of carriage that civilian life might soften over the years, but never fully disassembles. Carol Simmons was at the front desk when the automatic doors slid open for him. She was mid-40s, precise and sharp-eyed behind the reading glasses that lived on a beaded chain around her neck, moved on and off her face with the efficiency of someone who had stopped caring who noticed. 9 years at this desk. She knew Raymond by appointment number, by first name, and by the fact that he never complained even on the mornings when complaining would have been entirely reasonable. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," she said, fingers already moving toward the keyboard. "Dr. Wells is running about 10 minutes behind. You can take a seat in Section B." "I'll wait outside," he said. "It's a nice morning." She nodded, as though this was the expected response. For Raymond it was. The waiting room, rows of bolted chairs, a wall-mounted television tuned to a morning program nobody watched, the institutional hum of recycled air, was a place he avoided when the choice existed. Outside, at least, the air moved. He positioned himself near the building's side entrance, where a low concrete ledge provided something to look toward, and the traffic on Truxton moved past in steady, indifferent lines. He had his phone, a water bottle in the mesh side pocket of the chair, and approximately 20 minutes. It was 11 minutes before he noticed. He'd been reading an article on his phone, something about drought conditions affecting the Central Valley's almond crop, when his right hand dropped absently to the side of the chair, the way a person checks a pocket for keys without thinking. His fingers found the wheel rim. Normal. But something in the weight distribution felt different, and he looked up with the alertness of someone whose instincts were still calibrated to detect wrongness before the conscious mind caught up. A figure was moving quickly around the corner of the building. Young, mid-20s at most, wearing a grey hooded sweatshirt and jeans several sizes too large, moving with the directional urgency of someone with somewhere specific to be. In his hands was a folded, lightweight titanium frame. Raymond's hands went still on the wheels. In the 2 seconds it took his mind to process what he was seeing, the particular silver of that frame, the way it folded, the scratches he could identify from 40 feet. The figure had turned the corner and was gone. What remained was the older chair that had been parked beside his, the standard hospital-issue model that Carol kept in the side corridor for patients needing temporary equipment. The young man had executed the swap with practice speed, taken the titanium chair, left the hospital loaner, and walked away in under 90 seconds. Raymond sat very still. He was not a man inclined toward shouting. The training had worked that out of him young, and years of living with physical limitations that demanded constant emotional regulation had reinforced what the army had begun. He breathed once, then again. And then he spoke. Not to Carol behind the glass doors, not to the handful of people visible through the lobby windows, but to the air, to the empty corner where the figure had been. "They took my wheelchair again." It came out barely above a whisper, not theatrical, not designed to be heard, simply a fact spoken aloud because his mind needed the confirmation of hearing it in his own voice, but it was heard. Frank Brennan was coming through the side entrance door at that exact moment, 15 feet from where Raymond sat. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders, wearing a leather vest over a long-sleeved shirt. The vest carried a bottom rocker that read California and a chest patch with his name in block letters. His left arm bore a tattoo sleeve that extended to the wrist. Below his jeans, visible when he moved, was a knee brace, the legacy of a motorcycle accident 8 years back that had required surgical reassembly of his left patella. He had just completed a routine follow-up appointment for that same knee in the same building with a different doctor on a different floor. Frank Brennan was not a man who generated comfort on first impression. He was the kind of man that strangers on sidewalks gave slightly more room than necessary, not from any specific evidence of danger, but from the accumulated signal of his appearance, which had been built over 53 years and made no apologies for it. He had a face that recorded its history in the structure of it and had stopped accounting for other people's reactions to that history a long time ago. He stopped when he heard Raymond's words. He looked at the man in the older hospital chair, the absolute stillness of him, one hand flat on the wheel rim, eyes fixed on the corner where someone had just disappeared. Frank had spent enough of his life in situations that required rapid scene reading to understand immediately what had happened. "Sir," he said. His voice, when it came, was quieter than his appearance suggested. He crossed the distance to Raymond. "Was that your chair?" Raymond looked up at him. He took in the vest, the tattoos, the face. His expression did not change. "Yes," he said. "The kid in the grey hoodie." "Yes." Frank pulled out his phone. He did not say anything further to Raymond. He pressed a contact and walked 4 steps away. The conversation Raymond could overhear lasted fewer than 25 words. Then Frank walked back. "Your name?" Frank asked. "Raymond Calloway. Army, 22 years. Something in Frank's expression aligned itself. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated, like a compass finding the direction it was built for. "Marines," Frank said. 8 years, 2 tours, Fallujah." Raymond looked at him. "4th Infantry," he said. 2004. Frank nodded once, slowly. "Okay, Mr. Calloway." He put his phone away. "We're going to handle this." Raymond looked at him for a moment. "Who is we?" Frank glanced toward the street, then back. "You ever heard of the Hells Angels?" Raymond had. Of course he had. He'd grown up in California. He'd driven past their clubhouses, absorbed 30 years of news coverage, and carried the accumulated cultural image that the name produced. Motorcycles, federal investigations, men on the wrong side of every line that had ever been drawn. He said nothing. Frank read the silence with precision. "I know," he said simply, "but you needed to know who's going to find your chair." He said it without defense, as a transfer of information, clear, plain, and unambiguous. Raymond looked at the corner of the building one more time. Then he looked at Frank Brennan. "All right," he said. It was the quietest act of trust he had offered in years. 180 Reasons Dean Hartwell received Frank's call at 9:23 in the morning. He was in the garage behind his house on White Lane, a converted space that functioned simultaneously as workshop, office, and the place he went when his thoughts required more room than the house provided. 2 motorcycles in various states of reassembly occupied the center of the floor. The pegboard wall of tools was organized with the same methodical precision that had once made him an exceptional logistics sergeant. Each tool outlined in marker returned to its position after every use, the whole system a visible argument for the proposition that order is not constraint but foundation. A coffee maker on the workbench produced what Dean considered, without much humility, the best cup in Kern County. He bought good beans, paid attention to the water temperature, and had arrived at a morning ritual that was as close to meditative as a man like him got. He was 52 years old. He had served as president of the Bakersfield chapter of the Hells Angels for 7 years, 11 years as a full member before that, 2 years as a prospect before that, the period of earning that the organization required before any formal welcome. He held a master's degree in business administration from Cal State Bakersfield, a fact known almost exclusively to his family, his accountant, and the professors who had watched him sit quietly in the back rows of evening classes, while simultaneously managing a chapter of 200 members and raising 2 children. He ran a construction supply company that employed 23 people, filed its taxes on time, and maintained an unblemished commercial record. He was not the person that news stories about his organization tended to describe. He was also not naive enough to claim the organization's history was uncomplicated. He lived in the complexity of that without pretending otherwise. But the chapter he ran operated by a code, explicit, enforced, and foundational, and that code began with a principle that had been tested enough times to be self-evident. You protect those who cannot protect themselves. His father had come home from Vietnam in 1971, carrying things that had no civilian translation, no language for what he'd experienced, no system genuinely prepared to address what he brought back. 20 years of a life stretched thin, a man who gave everything that was asked of him and received in return a processing number and a pamphlet, and eventually stopped asking because the cost of making his need legible to systems designed for different kinds of people exceeded what he had left to spend. He died at 59, working a job that paid $11 an hour in a world that had thanked him formally and forgotten him practically. Dean had been 23 when that happened. He still hadn't found a way to put that loss somewhere it didn't inform every choice he made. Frank's call lasted 47 seconds. Disabled Army veteran, 22 years of service, wheelchair stolen from outside the VA, a lightweight titanium chair, personal property, not hospital equipment. Young male in a grey hoodie heading east from Truxton Avenue. Second time it had happened to this man. Dean set his coffee down on the workbench. He made 4 calls. Those 4 people each made 4 calls. Those 16 people each made 2 calls. Within 38 minutes, a network spanning Kern County and reaching into Tulare and San Bernardino counties had been activated, quietly, efficiently, with the kind of lateral mobilization that most organizations with 3 times the resources could not have replicated in 2 days. 180 members, on their bikes before 10 in the morning. Not to threaten. Not to make noise for the sake of noise. To find one wheelchair and return it to one man. Larry Gibbs saw them from his front porch. He'd been out there with his morning newspaper. He still took the physical paper, a habit he refused to surrender. When he heard the first bikes turn onto Pine Street, he looked up over his reading glasses. Then more came. Then, over the next 4 minutes, a procession that turned his familiar street into something he would describe later to his sister over the phone as an event, a genuine, actual event. He walked to the edge of his porch and watched them pass. 150, 160 more, the low thunder of engines filling the morning air with a sound that was simultaneously imposing and somehow purposeful rather than threatening. The riders were disciplined, moving in formation, unhurried. At the intersection they fanned out and divided into groups, each taking a different direction through the city. They were looking. Bakersfield's pawnshop district along Edison Highway was a loose constellation of storefronts with security grates and hand-painted signs, each one a repository of objects that had mattered to someone at some earlier point. Cash for gold, quick pawn, silver star loans, value exchange. The strip functioned as a known channel for items that moved along a compressed arc, from possession to desperation to cash, following the same gravity that pulled certain kinds of need toward certain kinds of transactions. Mike Fletcher had gone to the third shop on the block. He was 26 years old. He'd grown up in Oildale, north of Bakersfield, in a household that had been loving before it was broken, and broken before he was old enough to understand the difference. He'd been prescribed Vicodin at 22, after a car accident left him with a herniated disc and a prescription that outlasted the legitimate injury by a significant margin. What followed had not been a choice in any version of that word that felt accurate from the inside. It had been a narrowing, a progressive closing of available doors until the remaining options seemed like the only options because they were the ones still visible. He was not a cruel person. At his core, before the narrowing, he had been someone else entirely. He was a person in the grip of something that consumed what cruelty and compassion alike had been. He had seen the wheelchair outside the VA and processed it the way he processed most things now, as an object with potential value, available and unguarded. He had not thought veteran. He had not thought disability. He had not thought about the person whose entire radius of independent movement was contained in that folded titanium frame. He had thought maybe $200, maybe enough for 2 days. He was at the pawn counter, the chair leaning against the glass display case beside him, waiting for the shop owner to emerge from the back, when the door opened. Frank Brennan stepped inside. The 2 men looked at each other across 9 feet of linoleum flooring. Frank looked at the chair, then at Mike. His voice, when it came, was even and unhurried. "That chair belongs to a man who lost the use of his legs in Fallujah," he said. "He's been sitting in a hospital loaner for the past hour and a half." Something crossed Mike Fletcher's face. Not fear of Frank, though that was present, but something that preceded fear and ran deeper. A form of recognition. The moment when an act that had been abstract, an object, a transaction, a number, was given its actual shape by words that made the person behind it real. "I didn't know," Mike said. His voice was barely there. "No," Frank said. "You didn't." A silence that held the full weight of the morning. "The chair," Frank said. "That's what I need right now." Mike Fletcher picked up the wheelchair and held it out with both hands. Outside, 43 Hells Angels were parked along the curb, their engines cut, waiting with the particular stillness of people who have organized themselves around a purpose and are giving it room to resolve on its own terms. The weight of a name, Raymond, was still at the VA. Not by choice. Doctor Wells had insisted on completing the appointment once the shock of the theft had been addressed, and Carol Simmons had filed a police report with the kind of professional resignation that quietly communicated this was not the first incident the parking area had produced. She had brought Raymond a cup of water and said, without quite meeting his eyes, that the authorities would follow up. Her expression said something else entirely. Raymond knew the statistics. He had no illusions about where a stolen wheelchair ranked in the hierarchy of recoverable property. The appointment itself ran an hour. Dr. Patricia Wells, whom Raymond had worked with for 6 years, a compact woman in her early 50s with a direct clinical manner and a genuine expertise in what spinal cord injuries did to the body across decades of use, had reviewed his recent imaging and recommended a revised approach to the nerve pain protocol. Raymond asked 3 precise questions, thanked her in the way that was specific to him, brief, sincere, without performative elaboration. He was a good patient. He'd had sufficient practice. He waited in the side reception area in the borrowed hospital chair, which sat 3 inches lower than his own and required double the effort per wheel rotation. And he did not allow himself to dwell on where his chair was. He thought instead about the grain of the linoleum, the morning news ticker scrolling silently on the wall-mounted television, the way the fluorescent light made everyone in the room look equally fatigued, regardless of their actual condition. He thought about the 22 years that had led him to this chair, this building, this particular kind of waiting. At 12:43, Frank appeared in the doorway. His posture carried information. The specific ease of someone whose problem has been resolved. No residual tension in the shoulders, no searching quality to the eyes. Raymond moved the borrowed chair toward the doors. Frank held them open. He came through into the afternoon sun and stopped. The parking area was full, not scattered, arranged. Motorcycles in rows facing outward, exactly like a military formation. Riders standing beside them or sitting on them, and Raymond counted without deciding to count. The counting reflex of an infantry soldier who had learned early that numbers were operational information. More than 100. More than 150. At the front, between the first row of bikes and the entrance, stood a man Raymond had not seen before. He was holding Raymond's chair. The titanium frame caught the afternoon light cleanly. The familiar scratches visible from here, the worn grip on the left handle, the wheel locks he'd adjusted himself 2 years ago. His chair, exactly as it had been. The man walked forward, not tentatively. This was not a man who moved tentatively. He crossed the space between them and held the chair out, not with ceremony, but with the directness of someone returning something that should never have needed to be returned. "Mr. Calloway," he said. Raymond looked at the chair. He looked at the man. The muscles of his jaw were set in the particular configuration of a face managing the arrival of emotion faster than it had prepared for. "Your name," Raymond said. "Dean Hartwell, President Bakersfield Chapter." He said it without ornamentation, as one states a fact. "Marine Corps," Frank said quietly, from Raymond's right shoulder. "Like me." Raymond looked at Dean. "You served." "2 tours, Mosul, 2005 and 2007. A brief pause. "My father was in Vietnam, came home in 71, never got what he needed when he got back. Another pause, shorter. "I have a long memory for that." Raymond said nothing for a moment. He transferred from the borrowed chair to his own with the smooth economy of 20 years of practice, a motion so fluid it completed before most people registered it had begun. He settled in, placed his hands on the wheels. The fit was exact in the way that only something built for your specific body is exact. He let out a single slow breath. 180 men, he said. Not a question, a reckoning. "And one woman," came a voice from the second row of bikes, accompanied by a low, rolling ripple of laughter from the assembled crowd. Something in Raymond's face moved toward a shape it hadn't made in 4 hours. "The person who took it," he said. "Found him," Dean said. "Young man named Mike Fletcher. He's dealing with serious problems of his own." He gave the chair back without argument. "Police." Dean met his eyes without flinching. "That is entirely your call to make." Raymond thought about Mike Fletcher, 26 years old, grey hoodie, the particular hollowness of a person that desperation has worked over for long enough. He thought about systems designed to help, and how they failed in slow, institutionalized ways that nobody was required to account for. He thought about what it meant to be returned to the world without sufficient preparation, without sufficient support, without the language to name what had happened to you. He thought about his father, who had never come home from anything but had still somehow felt the same species of invisible. "No," Raymond said. Dean nodded once. The silence that followed settled over the parking area like weather. Not uncomfortable, but substantial. 180 people, or 181, if you accepted the correction from the second row, standing in the warm afternoon of Bakersfield in a formation that nobody had scheduled or announced, organized around a single chair that had been carried back from a distance that was less about geography than about the gap between what a person deserved and what they had actually received. Carol Simmons had come out of the building. She stood at the entrance with her reading glasses around her neck, observing with an expression that had completely abandoned professional neutrality. She looked like someone in the active process of revising a working assumption that had seemed reliable until approximately 12 minutes ago. "I want to ask you something," Raymond said to Dean. "Go ahead." "Why? You don't know me. You have your own chapter, your own responsibilities. Why mobilize this many people for a stranger's wheelchair?" Dean Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was level, not rehearsed, but the voice of someone who has thought about this question in various forms for a significant portion of his adult life. "Because someone has to," he said, "and it turns out we can." He let that land. There are a lot of people in this country who gave what they gave, to the service, to the work, and were handed back to civilian life like a problem somebody else was supposed to solve. My father was one of them. His eyes did not leave Raymond's. I have 179 people standing behind me right now who know that story in some personal version of their own. What we look like on the outside, he gestured briefly at the vest, at the crowd behind him, doesn't change what we carry on the inside. Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the 180 people behind him, the leather and the chrome and the road-worn faces and the machines and the organized, patient stillness of a group that had been asked to move and had moved. And he thought about the photograph on his nightstand, the 3 soldiers squinting into the Kuwaiti sun, the geometry of loyalty, what it looked like when it actually showed up, in the actual world, on an actual Tuesday morning in October. He extended his hand. Dean Hartwell took it. The handshake lasted 4 seconds. It was not dramatic. It was simply 2 men, each underestimated by the world in different ways and for different reasons, recognizing that truth in each other without needing to say it. What the world decides. It knows. The photograph appeared online at 2:47 in the afternoon. Not the video the young man on the sidewalk had started and then stopped recording. He'd lowered his phone when the moment exceeded what documentation could do with it. This was a different image entirely, taken through a fourth-floor VA window by an older woman who happened to have her phone out during her own appointment, the camera trembling slightly with the effort of reaching through the glass and across the distance to something that seemed, instinctively, to require recording. It showed Raymond in his wheelchair at the center of the frame, Dean Hartwell beside him, hands clasped in a shake that the camera had caught in the exact second of its fullest contact. Behind them, stretching across the parking lot and spilling onto the street beyond, more bikes and riders than the frame could fully contain, the formation of them reaching to every edge of the image like something without a clear perimeter. By 9 that evening, it had been shared 14,000 times. By midnight, 72,000. By the following morning, the image was in front of a national audience engaged in the uncomfortable work of reconciling what it was looking at with what it believed it understood about the people in it. The comments divided, as they always did. People who said they'd known it all along, people who said this changed nothing, and a larger, quieter population who shared the image without words, because the image was the statement, and adding words to it felt like a form of diminishment. Larry Gibbs saw it on his tablet before bed and sat with it for a long time. He thought about that morning, the sound of those engines filling Pine Street, the extraordinary matter-of-factness of it, the way 180 people had organized themselves around the recovery of a single object that was not, in the way that actually mattered, an object at all. He thought about what it represented. Not the chair as mechanism, but the chair as the specific form of independence it embodied for one specific person who had paid a very specific price for the right to need it. He texted Raymond, saw the photo going around, thought you should know. Raymond's response came after a pause. I know, going to bed early, talk tomorrow. Larry turned off the lamp, lay in the dark, and thought about the assumptions he carried through his daily life. Not assumptions he considered cruel or even conscious, but automatic ones. The kind that move below the surface until something like today makes them briefly, uncomfortably visible. He thought about a man in a leather vest who had stopped on Pine Street that morning and, without introduction, helped him carry a heavy bag of mulch from his car to the backyard. And when Larry had tried to pay him, he'd shaken his head and walked back to his bike. 3 words spoken in the entire exchange. Got it, sir. Larry had stood there in the morning air, holding the empty space where help had been, and thought that nothing in his 71 years had prepared him to be on the receiving end of exactly that. Raymond spent 2 days at home after the incident. Not from any physical limitation, from the need to think, which was, he had learned over many years, a need as legitimate and real as any other. He sat at the kitchen table with his histories and his coffee and gave the events of Thursday proper space to be understood rather than just catalogued. He had spent 22 years in an institution built entirely on hierarchy, structure, mutual obligation, and a specific kind of brotherhood that was as complicated as it was real. He had found, in the years since separating, that civilian life offered versions of these things, softer versions, less defined, harder to count on when the count actually mattered. What he had not anticipated was a Thursday in October when 180 strangers reorganized their mourning around the recovery of his property and then stood in a VA parking lot in formation in the afternoon sun for no reason other than that it was the right thing to do. He thought about Dean Hartwell, about Frank Brennan, the Marine who had been at the VA for his own appointment, carrying his own injuries forward through his own particular set of years, and had overheard 3 words spoken too quietly to be intended for anyone, and had acted on them without hesitation, without calculation, without the pause that institutions tended to insert between recognition and response. He thought about Mike Fletcher, On the second day, he called George Aldridge, the Veterans Services Coordinator at the VA, a man Raymond had spoken to twice before on administrative matters, and asked whether there were addiction outreach programs serving young men in the Bakersfield area with limited resources. Aldridge found 3. Raymond passed the information through Frank, who had, in some fashion that Raymond chose not to inquire into too specifically, maintained contact with Mike in the days following the incident, described only as keeping an eye on things, in the particular way of someone who understood that proximity sometimes precedes the possibility of change. Mike Fletcher called one of the numbers on Sunday afternoon. Raymond did not know what would come of it. He was not a man who traded in certainties about outcomes. He had lived long enough to understand that change was slow and non-linear and not guaranteed. But he knew what it meant to have a door appear in a landscape that had come to feel like only walls. Dean drove past the VA on Friday afternoon, no specific appointment, no destination that required passing it. He parked in the side lot, the same side entrance, and sat in his truck with the engine off, looking at the building for a few minutes. He thought about his father, as he always did in proximity to VA facilities. It was involuntary, like a reflex. The man who had come home from Southeast Asia in 1971, carrying things he had no names for, who had sat in waiting rooms like the ones inside this building, been handed pamphlets and processing numbers, and eventually stopped coming because the cost of asking, of making his need legible to systems that required a particular kind of bureaucratic fluency to navigate, had exceeded what he had remaining to offer. What his father had needed was not the abstraction of support. It was someone who showed up, someone who moved when moving was called for. Dean had spent 30 years building something that could move. He hadn't built it for this specific purpose. It had taken shape around other histories, other codes, other obligations. But when Thursday morning had called for it, it had moved like weather, like something that had been waiting to be aimed at something worthy of it. He started the truck. On the way home, he called the director of a veterans advocacy nonprofit based in Fresno, an organization he had quietly funded for 4 years through a structure that kept the source anonymous, because he had learned that donations from organizations with complicated public reputations generated more administrative friction than actual value for the people they were supposed to help. He told her he wanted to fund a rapid response wheelchair replacement and repair program. Veterans who lost or had their mobility equipment damaged, stolen, broken, worn past function, and were waiting on VA administrative processes that operated on timelines incompatible with the daily reality of living in a wheelchair. He wanted real chairs in real hands within 1 week of verified need. No forms, no processing numbers, no waiting rooms. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "We can build that." "Good," Dean said. "Let's build it." The following Monday morning, Raymond's chair was in its place beside the bed. He had checked it twice on Thursday evening, run his hands over the frame, the wheels, the familiar scratches. The way a person confirms the reality of something they are still, somewhere beneath awareness, processing. It was real. It was his. It was exactly where it belonged. He dressed, made coffee, sat at the table as the October light made its thin amber geometry through the blinds, and Bakersfield came awake around him in its ordinary early morning way. On the table beside his mug was a small card, plain white. No logo, no design. A phone number and a name, Dean Hartwell, written in the direct, unornamented handwriting of someone who had spent years filling out military paperwork. Below the number, 2 words, "For anything." Raymond looked at the card for a long time. He had spent years navigating a world that processed him through the lens of what he could no longer do, that saw the wheelchair before it saw the man, that saw the limitation before the fullness of a life containing considerably more than a single defining injury. He had spent years watching systems built around the concept of his well-being manage to make him feel unseen, undocumented in the ways that mattered, handed back to the world like an item without a clear category. He thought about what 180 people in a parking lot had actually looked like, not in the photograph, not as reported, but as he had experienced it from the chair, from the ground level of the scene, the weight and noise and absolute unambiguous usefulness of their presence. He thought about what the world had decided it knew about those people, how confident those decisions had been, how completely they had dissolved on contact with the actual morning. He thought about what he must have looked like to them, the quiet man in the chair outside the VA, the whispered words, the stillness of someone who had learned through years of institutional patience, of forms in triplicate, of waiting rooms and follow-up calls that led to voicemails, not to expect rescue, and how completely and permanently wrong that expectation had turned out to be. He picked up the card and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to where he kept things that mattered. Outside, the morning continued, unremarkable in its particulars, ordinary in its rhythms, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, open. Raymond Calloway finished his coffee, moved to his chair, and went out to meet it.